A very quick message before we start. I have reopened my Patreon. I would very much appreciate it if you'd consider taking a look and supporting this channel. Thank you all. And now, as promised, a deep dive into the early days of Chuck E. Cheese. I feel like most of us have been to a Chuck E. Cheese at least once in our lives, or we have a good idea of what it's like. Tokens, tickets, arcade games, pizza, and of course, the animatronic band. At least, that's how it was for a while. More and more, the animatronics are getting phased out. Chuck and his friends are still around, but they're being replaced with screens displaying puppet versions of the characters. While some people might be happy to see the sometimes creepy robots leave, I can't help but feel a little broken up about this. True, I haven't been in a Chuck E. Cheese in many years, but if anything signifies the end of an era, it's this. I want to use this video to look back at Chuck E.'s early days. The restaurants have been around since 1977, and that's a lot of history to cover. I'd like to focus on the first 13 years or so, up through 1990, since I find that to be the most interesting period. That, and listening to hours upon hours of Chuck E. Cheese show tapes all at once, is a bit maddening even for me. This era is where we saw the most changes to the characters in a short time period, where we watched a smart Alex cigar-smoking rat become the friendly, outgoing, tuxedo-clad mouse we all know and love. Obviously, things continued to change after that, which could maybe, potentially, be the subject for a future video. There are a lot of great sources online that I need to credit before we get started. The biggest help was showbizpizza.com, which is not only an invaluable resource for Chuck E. Cheese history, but also of their rival band, the Rock-afire Explosion. Definitely check this out, but I'll warn you, it's a rabbit hole. There are quite a few fan wikis out there that are also helpful, but I want to give specific thanks to Cheesepedia, which gets the most in-depth and thorough. On a quick technical note, I'll try to credit the voice actors behind these characters when I can, but there are quite a few with unidentified artists. If I don't say the actor's name, assume we don't know it. On one more technical note, there's not much footage or photos of some of these characters out there. This video might not be as heavy on the visuals as some of my others, but I hope you can still enjoy it, even if there's more listening than watching at certain points. Without further to-do, let's dive into the early days of Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater. Chuck E. Cheese, as we know today, was the brainchild of Atari founder Nolan Bushnell. Taking inspiration from Disneyland's animatronic shows, he wanted a family-friendly restaurant and arcade with robotic entertainers. The mascot was intended to be a coyote. Early on, Nolan ordered what he thought was a coyote costume from a catalog. It turned out to be a rat costume instead. The tail was the giveaway. Undeterred, he decided to have this character be the mascot, naming him Rick Rat. As you probably guessed, Rick became Chuck. A prototype animatronic was built to demonstrate that this character could indeed be the entertainer Nolan wanted. There's also some demo audio out there called the Big Cheese Birthday Show. We can hear different takes and ideas for Chuck's voice, all of them fairly gruff. Even in this early recording, the Big Cheese's personality is pretty close to how he would be when the restaurant first opened. There is also at least one other character introduced in the audio, a sidekick for Chuck, Crusty the Cat.
It's what's his name's birthday here, and I'm ready, Big C. Yep, not yet, Cat, not yet. No, all you know, happy birthday, right? Okay, 'cause we're all gonna sing along with Krusty here. All right, now we're ready, Cat. Right, Big C. All right, a happy birthday. Hold it, Cat. Hold it. Just hold it a minute. Where's the band? We promised all these people a band. There's no band here. I'm gonna have a band.
In 1977, the first Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater opened in San Jose, California. The restaurant would have 3 trademark features: pizza, arcade games, and an animatronic floor show. That last one will of course be the focus of this video. Now that the background section is out of the way, we can dive right into the ups and downs of Chuck E. Cheese and his Pizza Time players. The first animatronic setup used was called the Shelf, also known as the Portrait Show. I've spoken fondly of this version a few times. Instead of the characters being on a stage in front of the audience, they were actually placed in portraits around the room looking down on people. Essentially, it was a reverse theater in the round. It was incredibly unique, whimsical, and weird. Before the Pizza Time players were unleashed upon the world, a full demo show was recorded. John Widelock provided the voices for all the rough tracks, and it was clear that the characters were still getting fleshed out. Chuck showed some signs of having an attitude, but this would be expanded on much more in the future. In addition to some original songs and performances, several vintage recordings are included. It's not clear if these were placeholders so the programmers would have something to work with, or if this was something they considered pursuing further. The most surprising part of the demo show is how adult it got. It was never PG-13 or anything, but there were a handful of risque jokes that really wouldn't fly with some parents. It seems like the shows were intended to be more for everyone, not just kids. One of the vintage recordings, Cocktails for Two by Spike Jones and his City Slickers, made lots of references to debauchery, smoking, and drinking. The most risque joke is when Crusty the Cat talks about how his great-grandfather worked in a French cat house, and his great-grandmother had a dance that made her the most famous pussy in Paris. One recurring idea established here was that the robot characters were fully aware that they were mechanical. Chuck is heard griping about it quite a bit in one segment.
I bet some of yous have been out having fun at the drive-in. And I bet you didn't think about us here. Nailed to a wall. You know, we just hang around, cut in half. And you know which half they cut? The better half.
This would continue into the actual shows on and off over the years. Chuck would still reference it the most frequently early on. He truly seems to resent it in the demo show, but is a little more resigned to his lot in life as the years pass. That takes care of the creation of the characters. Let's go through the actual shows and take a closer look at all the Pizza Time players, from the well-known to the incredibly obscure. The first performer we'll discuss is naturally the leader himself, Chuck E. Cheese. There are two pieces of trivia that I'll get out of the way right now. Yes, the E stands for entertainment. This was established in 1994. According to Chuck's official backstory, he was an orphan who never knew his birthday. That's why his restaurant chain wants all kids to celebrate their own special days. That factoid was added in 2014. Meanwhile, back in 1977, Chuck was a loud-mouthed, bad-tempered, egotistical rat. And boy was he great. Even without the creepy early character design, Chuck was incredibly rough around the edges. For one thing, he smoked a cigar and prominently displayed it in the original portrait shows. He had a very thuggish persona, still voiced by John Widelock. Widelock based his performance on the character Muggs McGinnis from the East Side Kids film series. Generally, Chuck fell somewhere between a carnival barker and a low-level gangster. Today, Chuck E. Cheese is said to be a mouse, but in the original run, he was a rat. On occasion, you'll hear him referred to as a mouse in the early show tapes, but officially, he was very much a rat. And believe me, he looked and acted like one. Chuck was, quite frankly, a jerk most of the time. He never missed an opportunity to berate his co-stars. He was the boss, and wouldn't let anyone forget it. If he felt that any of them were taking too long in the spotlight, he was quick to get the attention back onto himself. Although he was generally smarter than the others, this caused him to overestimate his intelligence, and he often misused words. Of course, the Big C was not without his good points. He really did care about giving everyone out there a great show and a place to celebrate their birthdays. As nasty as he could be to his fellow Pizza Time players, I can't picture Chuck ever being mean to a child. Out of all the other characters, Chuck had the most interesting relationship with Jasper the Hound Dog, who we'll get to in a moment. Jasper got on his nerves more than anyone, but multiple times in the early days, we'd see Chuck give the dog his own spotlight performance. Whenever Jasper felt depressed, which wasn't often, but it did happen, Chuck would help cheer him up. Of course, he regretted doing so once Jasper was feeling better. Why's that? Well, let's move on to Jasper and find out. Jasper T. Jowls was, and still is, the band's resident country singer. Voiced by Scott Paulin, Jasper strummed, sang, and laughed his way through the shows. His most defining trait that one could gather just by looking at him was Southern. He's always been a country dog, through and through. He even had an original theme song, Roots in the Country, which he performed every now and then. Once you actually listen to Jasper, you'll find out his other defining trait, his sense of humor. Any joke, no matter how stupid, would send Jasper into a fit of uncontrollable laughter. Even just the mention of laughing in a song lyric could be enough to get him going. As a result, Jasper sounded rather deranged, even when speaking normally.
Howdy! Howdy, howdy, howdy! It's Jasper T. Jowls here, the country singingest dog that ever stepped up to a fire hydrant.
When Jasper got too crazy, which was quite often, Chuck would call for a technician to, in his words, turn off the fruitcake dog. One of the employees backstage would usually oblige, powering Jasper off. Disturbingly, Jasper sometimes let out a sharp ow when this happened. Jasper is also a hopeless romantic. He really loved the ladies, and flirted with a good deal of the guest stars, Sally Sashay, Foxy Colleen, and especially Harmony Howlette. When love struck, he did the opposite of laugh. He howled, loudly and passionately, much to Chuck's irritation. As popular as Jasper's been over the years, I find myself agreeing with Chuck in these early show tapes. Whenever Jasper starts laughing or howling, I want to turn him off too. The only human member of the Players is Pasqually, the pizza chef. In very recent years, his full name has been revealed to be Pasqually P. Pie Plate, but back then, he was just Pasqually. With a mustache as thick as his Italian accent, Pasqually is in charge of the kitchen, but he always finds time to do a performance. In fact, in the portrait show, Pasqually was positioned directly over the kitchen, implying he was working when he wasn't singing. An early idea was to have him actually announce when customers' pizzas were ready, presumably not during a show, but too many orders were being made at once to keep this up. Early Chuck seemed to value Pasqually more as a chef than a performer. He would sometimes shout at the technician to send Pasqually back into the kitchen, much like he told them to turn Jasper off. Pasqually loved the spotlight just as much as he loved making pizzas, and always came back out. He was also the only original Pizza Time player to occasionally insult Chuck right back.
Hey, Pasqually, why don't you lace up your mouth and run out your head as a football?
Hey, boss, why don't you stick your tail in your mouth and rent yourself out as a hula hoop?
Take a rest.
Once the setup was changed to all the characters on stage together, Pasqually was finally allowed to sit beside the others and sing his heart out. Pasqually's original voice was provided by Joe Spano, who made him sound kind of rough around the edges. It fit well with the original Pizza Time theater, where everyone had a rough side. He was the most theatrical of the original players, often belting his solos out in a mock operatic style. I guess a pizza chef needs to be well versed in ham. The Warblettes are an often overlooked aspect of the early Pizza Time days. These three blackbirds, Daisy, Maisie, and Ermengarde, generally sang backup. The first show tapes were the ones where they had the most exposure. The girls had a few solo numbers, could be heard tweeting during certain songs, and were regularly acknowledged by Chuck.
He's here to Warblettes. That's Daisy. That's Maisie. And there's the lovely Ermengarde.
Hi, everybody. Now just sit back and get ready, cause here comes the show.
The girls would get actual lines on rare occasions, but their dialogue was brief. They didn't really have much in the way of personality, and their speaking roles were almost exclusive to the first 2 years of operation. They were ultimately set dressing to make the show look and sound good. The original Warblettes were simple animatronics that could only move their beaks. When the portrait setup was changed to a traditional stage, the Warblettes received a makeover. The new figures were also simple, but could sway in addition to the beak movement. As a drawback, their beaks were all synced up, so they could only move at the same time. This greatly limited the character dialogue, since everything they said would have to be in unison. The most mysterious thing regarding the Warblettes was their brief replacement. For about a year, the birds were swapped out for a different trio of singers, the Mopsy sisters. These girls looked a good deal like anthropomorphic mops, hence their name. Any show tapes featuring the sisters are almost entirely lost, so there's not much to go off of here. Maybe the Mopsy sisters were wonderful characters who always stole the show. More likely, though, they were just the Warblettes with a different name and design. I should also give mention to the clapperboard, a wonderfully offbeat device that sat on the wall. Instead of a sign prompting the audience to applaud, this one did the applauding itself. The clapperboard had a number of animal hands and feet that applauded and apparently cheered as well. It wouldn't be out of place in Pee-wee's Playhouse. Then there's the band board, or drummer board, which drummed along with the performance. The demo tapes go so far as to name a full Pizza Time orchestra, with members like Wally Washboard and Timmy Triangle. The show always had a full instrumental backing, but I assume that the orchestra members were playing off stage, out of the audience's sight. The band board, to my knowledge, was the only musical accompaniment that people could actually see. Finally, we have the last of the original Pizza Time players, Crusty the Cat. He was meant to be Chuck's main sidekick, but alas, he was only around for a year. Actually, we're pretty lucky to know all we do about Crusty. There was a time when all we had was a photo and a short voice clip. Now a good deal of Krusty's original audio has been found, and we have a better idea of who this forgotten cat was. It's rather appropriate that he had such a short run, since everything about Crusty was meant to reflect his personal misfortune, even his name. He wore a jersey with the number 13 on it, he had a downtrodden expression, he was a black cat, and worst of all, he was a cat that had to work for a rodent. Poor Crusty tried, he really did. He clearly enjoyed performing and was so desperate to please his boss. No matter what, nothing he did was ever good enough for Chuck. This was true of pretty much all performers back then, but Crusty seemed to take it the hardest. Jasper laughed it off, excessively, and Pasqually fought back, but Crusty just took the abuse and promised to do better next time. Chuck criticized him often, and while Crusty could be a bit of an airhead, there were other times where he was actually a little smarter.
Crusty the Cat, who's gonna delight you all with a few expressions, then he's waked up here.
Big C, I'm gonna do some impressions.
What I said, expressions.
Big C, an impression is when you do an imitation of somebody real famous.
You don't think I don't know something as elementary as that? Come on, Cat, quit stalling. Express.
Sorry, Big C.
I have a personal fondness for Crusty. I've always rooted for the underdog, or under-cat in this case. Compared to the slightly grotesque original animatronics, Crusty came across as being relatively cute. He also had the best singing voice next to the Warblettes. His elusiveness made him pretty novel as well. Ironically, a single Crusty figure is one of the only surviving portrait bots still around today. In addition to his vocal talents, Crusty was reportedly the writer of the original Pizza Time Theater theme song. The characters continued to sing it for a few years after Crusty left, and I hope he received some royalty checks at the very least. The one thing that didn't click for me with Crusty was his baseball motif. I understood the 13 jersey, but he also held a baseball bat in one location and was featured in promotional artwork catching a fly ball. Nothing about his personality reflected his outfit or accessory. I suppose if he had lasted a little longer, we could learn about the swingers team he supports. I get the feeling it hasn't been their season for a long time. Apparently, the entertainment director wanted a monster character in the cast. They needed to make room, and it was Crusty who ended up getting tossed to the curb. I like to imagine that he left voluntarily after taking so much abuse from Chuck, but we know the truth. Crusty probably begged for his job and then made a sad, undignified exit. Here's to you, Crusty. Wherever you are, I hope you're getting treated right. The monster that replaced Crusty is more well known. Mr. Munch, the purple pizza eater, came onto the scene in 1978. He spoke with a low, gravelly voice, courtesy of Scott Wilson. When Munch was introduced, they reused certain shows that had previously featured Crusty. Krusty's vocals were either removed or replaced, but occasionally you can hear the faint echo of the poor cat under Munch's voice. It's hard to find a show tape where Munch doesn't mention his love of pizza several times. He really has a one-track mind, and has even been known to steal pizzas from his friends. Luckily for him, they don't seem to mind most of the time. It helps that they all work at a pizza place, so there's plenty of food to go around.
Does anyone have a dream?
I do! Oh, I wish I may eat 5 pizza pies tonight!
In fact, Munch is so one-track in his love of pizzas that I'm having trouble coming up with much to say about him. He comes off as a bit slow-witted sometimes, but the same thing could be said about Jasper, Pasqually, and Crusty. These are not exactly the most nuanced characters out there, but I've been taking notes as I've listened to the early show tapes, and I really don't have much to say about this shaggy alien. Oh right, he's an alien. I can at least talk about his backstory. This was explored in a 1979 comic. The very surreal Rat Tails story has Chuck and Jasper get kidnapped into outer space by a rogue arcade machine. They are able to scramble his circuits and try to fly themselves home, but get lost on a planet made entirely of pizza. This happens to be the home of Mr. Munch, who agrees to help them get back to Earth if they let him come with them. Back home, the arcade game has captured Pasqually and the Warblettes, imprisoning them in the walls. Yes, that portrait stage was apparently a bad thing this whole time. Who knew? The offbeat comic ends with Chuck singing badly enough to destroy their robotic oppressor and the restaurant around them. The final seat in the show roster belonged to a rotating guest star. Every show tape had a special guest, all of them female. A few male guests were proposed, Elkton John and Glenn Camel, but they never came to fruition. The guests we'll be discussing are Helen Henny, Foxy Colleen, Madame Oink, Sally Sashay, and Harmony Howlette. Each of them used the same base figure, which could be converted, or retrofitted as they called it, into a different guest over the years. A few of these early show tapes are lost. Helen Henny was the first known guest, but her original show tape is currently missing. Outside of a couple brief clips, photos, and videos, we don't have much to go off of. We'll return to Helen shortly, but first we'll talk about the next guest, whose show tape we do have, Madame Oink. Madame Oink was also known as the Piggy from Paris. She did not want you to forget her proud nationality. Voiced by Paula Mulcahy with a thick French accent, Oink's shows were typically themed around romance and world travel. Regardless of all the places Oink has visited, the City of Lights was truly her home. Although I'll be calling her Madame Oink, she insists that the proper pronunciation is Madame Oink. She would always correct Chuck E. Cheese when he introduced her, but he very rarely got it right. I'm just saying it the American way because, quite frankly, it's easier. Oink fancied herself a great lover, and would often flirt with the other performers, and occasionally the audience. The Pizza Time players were not nearly as enamored with her.
Wow, Madam Oink!
Oink.
Whatever. You travel all over the world there, don't you?
I get around a lot.
You certainly got a lot to get around. All right, pipe down, you nitwits!
Yes, there were a lot of fat jokes, but either Oink didn't notice or just brushed them off. Generally, she took herself seriously as a performer and got the show back on track whenever the players devolved into their usual nonsense. As much as she loved men, her truest love was always the spotlight. She seemed to have a particular fondness for Pasqually, who didn't really reciprocate. An early show tape referred to her as his ex, but for the most part, their romance was one-sided. The chef was often roped into performing a romantic duet with the pig, and she never seemed to realize or care that he wasn't enjoying himself.
For I'm loved by Pasqually's pizza boy.
All right, Pasqually, big finish.
Hey, boss, I'm not big enough for this finish.
You get out there.
Ma falagonia.
A few more notable traits of Oink. Being a pig, she snorts. A lot. The amount of snorting varied from show tape to show tape, but in the earlier days it was everywhere, and I personally found it unpleasant to listen to. Thankfully, by her final appearance, they toned it down greatly. She also had her own original theme song, The Lady of Oink, no relation to Lady of Spain. Madame Oink had the most appearances as a guest star. For some reason, someone behind the scenes really loved this character. By the end, she had grown on me, but that's also due to her final appearance being the strongest. The last show tape introduced a new character, the Toon Machine, voiced by Mike Hatcher. He apparently belonged to Oink, and could somehow transport the performers anywhere in the world, or to any time period, accompanied by the appropriate musical genres. The Toon Machine was in charge now, calling the show Madame Oink's World of Music. Chuck E. Cheese was incredibly miffed by this, insisting that his name should be in the title. It's not clear if Oink programmed the Toon Machine or if she just bought it, but they're very protective of each other. The Toon Machine makes sure she gets the spotlight, and goes out of its way to pronounce her name correctly, Madame Oink. Oink, meanwhile, defends the Toon Machine from Chuck's insults.
Hey, Toon Machine, quit trying to get into the act.
I can't if Madame Oink says so.
Quite right. Leave him alone, Chucky.
You stay out of this.
Interestingly, this is one of the few show tapes to have some sort of a narrative arc, even if it's a minor one. Chuck starts off resenting the Toon Machine, but actually warms up to it as the show continues. He never admits this, of course, since this is when he was a much harsher character. Typically, the shows were written as standalone pieces set around the same theme. Guests were not really expected to sit and pay close attention to each show, since it would be next to impossible in a place like Pizza Time Theater. Even here, it's not a major in-depth story, just something fun to pick up on if you listen to it in full. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. A flirtatious, blonde, prima donna pig who has a fondness for French culture? This is Miss Piggy. Well, at this point, Miss Piggy had really only been around for a year or so. She was not yet a cultural icon. I really believe that her similarities to Madame Oink are a coincidence. To add to the admittedly strange parallels, both characters were conceived as Piggy Lee, named after singer Peggy Lee. While I don't believe Madame Oink was meant to be a ripoff of Piggy, the more I think about it, the more I wonder if Mr. Munch was drawn from Cookie Monster. Gotta love those Muppets. Some restaurants had enough space for a separate eating area, which designated its own animatronics, known as cabaret performers or lounge performers. The first one we'll be covering is the hippo from Hoboken, the sultry Dolli Dimples. Dolly was introduced in 1978, sat at a piano, and performed solo numbers. The first two restaurants had this slightly unpolished design, while all the others had a refined version that was more on the cartoony side. Unlike some future cabaret performers, Dolly had a very distinct personality. The cabaret acts were often at a disadvantage, since unlike the main players, they didn't have anyone to bounce off of. There couldn't be any banter. Despite this, Dolli would often bookend her songs with a bit of dialogue and make little quips during her singing. Sometimes she would talk about her numerous past husbands who simply couldn't keep up with her. Her first husband was named Nolan, one of the many inside jokes made about Mr. Bushnell. Other times, she blatantly flirted with the audience.
Psst. Hey, you over there. Yes, you cutie. I thought I'd make this next medley hot for a handsome devil like you.
Dolli was actually created with adults in mind. Her first show tape was full of innuendos, none of them very subtle. The portrait show demo had some risque jokes, but I believe Dolli surpassed them. There was even a mechanism in her chest to make her breasts bounce. Still, there was no good way to keep kids out of the lounge area, and naturally, they'd be attracted to another cartoon character. It's a singing hippo. Who wouldn't go check her out? I'm just not sure how happy the parents were with some of her dialogue.
My second husband, Donald, used to say, if I was caught between two evils, I'd generally go for the one I haven't tried before.
Dolli's original voice from 1978 was supplied by Donna Miller, who was only 19 at the time. She really knocked it out of the park, making this animatronic hippo at a pizza place sound much better than she had any right to. A second show tape was produced in 1982 with a new voice from Lady Bianca.
Well, hello, all you nice-looking folks out there. It's me again, Dolli. Dolli Demetra Dolores Daniela Doreen Dimples. You can call me Dolli for short. Miss Dimples to you, gorgeous.
Well, there wasn't anything wrong with Bianca's vocals. They lacked that spark that Miller provided. The first Dolli really sounded like a sultry lounge singer who had been around the block a couple dozen times. She just happened to be a hippo. Bianca's version feels less raw. It's more polished. It doesn't help that when Dolli did still make innuendos and reference her ex-husbands, it wasn't quite as overt. A little more appropriate for kids, certainly, but not as fun. Regardless of the slightly less than stellar second run, Dolli Dimples remains a fan favorite. In 1979, Helen Henny moved from the portrait show to a cabaret corner all of her own. I'm not really sure if that's an upgrade or a downgrade, but she probably enjoyed having the spotlight. Much like Dolli's songs were accompanied by her piano, almost all of Helen's numbers were with a solo guitar. She was voiced by Paula Mulcahy, who also voiced her in her original Lost show tape. Helen prided herself on being a movie star. Like Jasper and Madame Oink, she had an original theme song, Hollywood Chicken Coop, which she often sang a few lines of during her medleys. Just listening to her go on about her career made it pretty clear that despite her ego, Helen wasn't as famous as she thought.
Oh, and now, my adoring audience, a song from The Sound of Music. A movie where I was up for the leading role, you know, but what? Oh, Julie something or other got it instead. Foul play. Oh, well, that's Hollywood.
This version of Helen is a funny character, but her songs are a little difficult to listen to. One of my notes just says, infernal clucking, which really sums it up. As I mentioned, I hate Madame Oink's snorting, but Helen's loud squawkings might be even worse. Maybe if she could just keep them under control, she'd have better roles. After all, if she's such a big star, why is she performing in a Pizza Time Theater lounge? Hopefully, no one ever asked her that. One of her funniest moments is when she has a moment of clarity about her situation.
You know, actually, the movie got divided notices. I loved it, and the critics hated it. But I suppose that's really too true to be funny, isn't it?
Even if she never made it big in the Hollywood Chicken Coop, this was not the end of Helen's story. We'll be seeing her again in a couple of years, where she'll be getting something many of these other characters never received: job security. In 1980, a new setup for the animatronics was introduced. The balcony stage had all the characters on the stage together in front of the patrons. This became the standard design for the stage shows. Future alterations would come, but the balcony remained the main template going forward. As much as I love the portrait design, I imagine it required a bit of neck craning. In this transition phase, some shows performed as both a portrait show and a balcony show. That's where we get our next guest star from 1979, Sally Sashay, the Disco Skunk. By that title alone, you know that Sally was dated from the start. At that point, disco was already on the way out. Not that it stopped Sally, who still did her best to give everyone a good show. Voiced by Lady Bianca, Sally belted out disco tunes with plenty of passion. Her fellow performers were very complimentary to her voice, but couldn't help but criticize her smell. She was a skunk after all. Sally's spirit was as strong as her pipes. She never let them get her down, and would sometimes fire right back.
Thank you. I can tell you I appreciate good music. And as far as that big mouth rat Chuck E. Cheese, honey, he can complain about what my perfume does to his nose all he wants. I know his ears haven't heard music this good in years, honey.
Jasper was particularly fond of her and was prone to flirting. Alas, their love could never be. Hounds have a very strong sense of smell. Sally remains the most obscure of the guest stars. Unlike the others, who all appeared multiple times, she only had one show tape. Her music may have remained firmly in the 70s, but her smell stuck around much longer. Geez, skunk jokes really are easy. We're going a little out of order for our next character, Foxy Colleen. Yeah, that's right, her name's Foxy. Go ahead, make your jokes, I can't stop you. Anyway, speaking of names, this character has been called both Foxy Colleen and Foxy Flanagan. From what I've found, Colleen can be an Irish term for a young girl, and Flanagan is her actual last name. And if there's one word that describes Foxy, it's Irish. Foxy's theme was Irish folk songs. Unlike Madame Oink, who quickly moved beyond just French music, Ireland seemed like Foxy's main wheelhouse. While I'm sure there are hundreds upon hundreds of Irish songs out there, it did seem like an odd niche for an American restaurant. And they actually kept this up for 3 show tapes. At least I think they did. That's where things get confusing. As I said, we're going a little out of order. Foxy debuted in 1978 and had a second show tape in 1980. Both of these tapes are unfortunately missing. The only one we have is her third and final show tape from later in 1980. Even then, it's been suggested that some or all of the songs in the tape are recycled from one of the earlier shows. For one thing, Mr. Munch is totally silent during her songs, and 1978 would have been when he came in to replace Crusty. The entirety of the Foxy recordings that we have comes to a little under 10 minutes of material. I'm guessing there's more out there, but it's anyone's guess as to whether or not we'll ever hear it. Another mystery is her voice. Foxy is one of the uncredited characters, but I've heard it speculated that she was performed by Paula Mulcahy, who is also Madame Oink and Helen Henny. It certainly does sound like her doing an Irish accent. Foxy seemed nice, but given how little there is of her out there, I can't say much about her personality. Chuck was unusually friendly toward her in the available audio, and Jasper was naturally smitten. While Foxy mentioned she was already spoken for, she ended up going off with Jasper anyway. What happens in Pizza Time Theater stays in Pizza Time Theater.
Begorra, you're a wonderful audience, and I hope you stay for the next show. As for you, Mr. Jasper, I'll see you later.
Oh, I love her.
Foxy Colleen will probably remain a mystery, but the little bit we have of her is very pleasant, much like the fox herself. Artie Antlers was the second cabaret performer. Introduced in 1980, he was a moose and a retrofit of Dolli Dimples. He was sort of a male equivalent to everyone's favorite hippo. He covered several of the same songs and medleys Dolly had, and also had a smooth romantic side. He often expressed his fondness for the ladies, but never got overtly flirtatious with the audience the way Dolly did. Artie had a lot of spirit, and was wonderfully performed by Jim Cunningham. His biggest asset, aside from moose puns, was his stage presence. He had a truly infectious energy when he tickled the ivories.
You are listening to the mellow sounds of Artie Antlers, the musical moose. And now we're going to get jazzy and downright razzmatazzy.
Dolly was very much an open book, but Artie didn't reveal nearly as much about his personal life. I like to imagine that off stage he was actually a very quiet, reserved person who only let loose when he was performing. And then I remember that I'm coming up with a headcanon about an animatronic moose, and I start to question my sanity. Then I look at the audience response to my videos about animatronics and say, screw sanity, I want views. Harmony Howlette rode onto the scene in 1981. She was an Annie Oakley type, a Wild West performing coyote. And boy did she live up to her name. Helen Henny had her clucking, Madame Oink had her snorting, and Harmony Howlette had her howling. This would often prompt similar howls from Jasper. Unlike the clucks and snorts, Harmony's howls were a little less annoying, since they were generally softer and used at times when they wouldn't totally disrupt the show. Harmony's 2 show tapes were both appropriately country-themed. It was perhaps because she was so country that the equally southern Jasper was completely in love with her. Although Jasper drooled over Sally Sashay and Foxy Colleen, he had it the worst for Harmony. Luckily for him, she seemed to reciprocate his feelings. It was actually pretty sweet. Mr. Munch and Pasqually appeared to be enamored with her as well, just not to the point that Jasper was. The only character not charmed by Harmony was Chuck E. Cheese. As I said, Chuck insulted almost everyone, guests and regulars alike. What separated Harmony is just how much he pushed right back. We've had a few characters insult Chuck in return, but Harmony didn't let up. This, in turn, made Chuck double down. The result is funny, but at times a little exhausting. Her show tapes have a rather hostile vibe, but it's nice to see someone stand up to the Big C.
Big C, folks wait in line for every one of Harmony's shows.
Yeah, to get out of the theater.
I heard that. Now listen, you city-fied cheese nibbler. I can keep up the singing just as long as you can keep up the insulting.
It went so far as Harmony threatening to leave near the end of the second show tape. Chuck convinced her to stay and apologized the best he could, but it seems that Miss Howlette meant it. Despite being a fan favorite, Harmony did not have another appearance after 1982. Of course, there's a real reason for this, but I do like to imagine she just couldn't stand to work with Chuck anymore. Harmony's voice is uncredited, but like Foxy Colleen, it's been speculated that was Paula Mulcahy. Once again, if you listen to her, there's certainly a resemblance to the voices she did for Oink and Helen. If these characters were all the same person, she had a real talent for doing accents. The Beagles were a band consisting of 4 dogs added to the lounge in the early 80s. 3 guesses on who they're spoofing. The dogs, all named after their inspirations, were John, George, Paul, and Ringo. Only John ever spoke, giving a little quip or anecdote about their lives before they began to sing. All their songs were taken directly from Beatles albums, using the Fab Four's vocals. The only new recordings done were for John's brief dialogue tracks before or after the songs. We learn that one of their albums was Sgt. Puppy's Lonely Hearts Club Band. We also learn that their first 2 movies were A Hard Dog's Night and Yelp. These dog puns were pretty much the most insight we got into the characters, but they're sometimes worth a chuckle.
Well, we all heard the Paul is dead thing. Actually, it was all a misunderstanding. He wandered off and we had to go pick him up at the pound.
I imagine the Beagles were easy to produce, since John's lines were the only original aspect. There are 3 Beagle show tapes, and a few of John's intros get repeated for different songs. We're going to see this formula used in several Cabaret characters, where they would essentially coast off the talent of the original artist's recordings. In fact, that's just what our next group did. The 4 Little Shavers were a retrofit of the Beagles. They were incredibly rare, and were only used with a special ice cream parlor section in a small number of Pizza Time theaters. This barbershop quartet consisted of Nolan, McNolan, O'Nolan, and Curly. They sang to old recordings of the Buffalo Bills. It's unclear if there was any new dialogue recorded for these characters, but if there was, it's been lost to time. I'm really sorry there's not more I can say about these guys. Up next is one of the better-known Cabaret characters, the myth, the legend, the lion, the king. This mountain lion first appeared in 1982 as a stand-in for Elvis Presley. Standing at 9 feet tall, he was an impressive creation, who even tapped his foot to the beat of his songs. Equally impressive was his career. Most of the Cabaret acts had maybe a couple of show tapes if they were lucky. Even the beloved Dolli Dimples only had 2 produced. The king had a whopping 7, 2 of which are currently lost. He also stuck around through the mid-90s, something most of the other characters did not. There's really not that much to say about the king's personality. He didn't speak much outside of song intros and endings, but he seemed to be good friends with the other Pizza Time players. His dialogue mentioned them often, implying they hung out between shows.
You know, you can say what you want about Chuck E. Cheese, but I'll tell you, probably the greatest moment of my life was when old Chucky signed me up for his show at the Rat Garden. That was a turning point, my first big break. So this next song is for Chuck E. Cheese.
The king went through several voices over the years, some sounding better than others. His first show tape from 1982 was set exclusively to original Elvis recordings, with the only new material being the king's spoken lines, like the Beagles. The following year was mostly the same, but there were a couple new recordings, birthday versions of Elvis songs sung by the king's voice actor. The 1985 show tape was made of entirely new recordings. They were still Elvis songs, but the king himself was singing all of them, as opposed to lip-syncing to the real Elvis. There was also a cheering audience added throughout the show tape. The king had 2 show tapes done in 1990, where he was voiced by Frankie C. These ones had a few more changes. For one thing, he had some unseen female backup singers. The most noticeable change was that he would frequently roar. I guess this was akin to some of the gimmicks the others had, like Harmony's howling. As annoying as Helen's clucks or Oink's snorts could get, I feel that the king's roars are the most jarring. Not irritating per se, but they really threw me off.
Thank you all for being here. I'd like to dedicate this next song to a very dear friend of mine, Miss Helen Henny.
The final King show tape was produced all the way in 1995, although his career ended not with a roar, but with a whimper. He had a handful of new songs that were not Elvis covers, nor did they sound anything like Elvis. These were songs that had been written the previous year for Chuck E. Cheese and Friends on the main stage. Suddenly, the King was singing all about how much he loved pizza.
If I wasn't playing this guitar right now, I'd get up and really show you how to do the shuffle. Then I'd like to shuffle off to the kitchen and get me some of Chucky's great pizza.
Well, the King never had that much personality. He still had a spark, most of it owed to Presley himself. Now he was just a generic character who happened to dress like Elvis. Sometimes that's just how it goes. Our final Cabaret character from 1982 is BB Bubbles. This circus elephant was a retrofit of Dolli Dimples and Artie Antlers. Instead of the piano, she played the calliope, fitting into the circus theme. Her bizarre hair resembled several slinkies, and she held the microphone in her trunk. BB was sort of an anti-Dolly. The hippo from Hoboken was a shameless flirt, who delighted in innuendos and genuinely sensual performances. BB, on the other hand, was geared firmly at the younger audiences. She would flirt on occasion, but no matter how many audience members she called handsome, she was completely sterile. I know that really is a good thing in the grand scheme for a child-focused location, but after the provocative powerhouse that was Dolli Dimples, BB is a major letdown. There are only 3 tracks of her show tape currently available, but they paint a pretty solid picture of her offerings. Singing in a cartoonishly shrill voice, BB would reminisce about the many places she traveled while with the circus. We have a Midwestern medley, a Southern medley, and a California medley. She mentions that Chuck discovered her in a performance of Madame Elephant in New Orleans. I assume that's a weird elephant version of Madame Butterfly, which piques my curiosity more than an offhand joke really should. About halfway through each medley, BB makes a terrible joke and laughs uproariously at it. I'm sure she and Jasper get along just fine.
When we were traveling through Southern California, a big-time movie producer wanted to make a film about wonderful me. He wanted to call it E.T. Elephant Trunks.
Given her very brief career at Pizza Time Theater, there aren't many pictures or videos of BB performing in the 80s. Based on what I've heard from her show tape, I don't think we're missing all that much. But she remains an interesting, high-pitched little footnote. Well, we've spent enough time with the Cabaret characters. Let's get back to the main showroom. Helen Henny must have decided she'd been out of the spotlight for too long, because she returned in 1983, still voiced by Paula Mulcahy. Now she was back performing alongside the Pizza Time players, appearing on the balcony stage for the first time. Like in her solo gig, Helen's role as an actress was highlighted. This time, instead of focusing on her Hollywood career, the emphasis was on her stage roles. Helen's show was Broadway themed, with the characters performing many classic show tunes. Helen still had a major ego, but it wasn't quite as overblown as her Cabaret days. Another character to get toned down a bit was Chuck E. Cheese himself. He was just a little nicer this time around, although he was still quite the smart aleck.
Oh, yeah. Well, just remember, Helen, you're going out there just a chicken, but you'll be coming back a chicken. Well, what did you expect?
All in all, the Broadway Helen show tape is an enjoyable one, especially if you're a theater fan like me. If you're wondering who the next guest star was, I have some bad news for you. Around this time, Pizza Time Theater ran into major financial problems. The animatronics, famous as they were also a bit pricey to maintain. Retrofitting the guest star characters a couple times a year was too expensive. Since most stores had Helen Henny doing her Broadway routine, it was decided that she would be a guest no longer. The chicken was here to stay. In the shows going forward, the Warblettes had a bit of a resurgence. While they still remained underdeveloped as characters, they were given more solos and generally acknowledged a bit more by the other cast members. It helped that Helen was also a bird, so they seemed to have something in common. In addition, the girls received a new, more colorful redesign. One of their biggest moments came in the 1987 New Year's show when Chuck asks everyone about their resolutions. The Warblettes actually get a bit of dialogue. As always, they speak in unison.
Hey, Worms, have you girls made your New Year's resolutions yet?
Yes, Chuck E. This year we resolved to put more of our money in the bank.
Oh, I get it. Kind of a nest egg, huh?
Right.
As the 80s went on, several characters would be recast. The first one to go was John Widelock, the original Chuck E. Cheese. Widelock did a wonderful job with the character, but when listening to the show tapes, it becomes very clear that he really couldn't carry a tune. The Rat Tales comic I mentioned even made that a crucial plot point. In 1983, a Christmas special was produced called The Christmas That Almost Wasn't. I'm not really planning on covering the special in full detail, since it's not very good. In fact, it was never really finished, and what we have is a fully colored work in progress. Even if it had been properly completed, I feel like it would have been a pretty dull special. Chuck and Jasper are the only Pizza Time characters to appear, and even they don't have nearly as much screen time as you'd expect. Near the end, Chuck sings a song to the elves about teamwork. Widelock tried, but couldn't sing it right. Mr. Munch's voice actor, Scott Wilson, could sing it fine, and was made the new Chuck E. Cheese on the spot. Ouch. For whatever reason, Wilson also took over as Pasqually in 1984, and briefly voiced Jasper in 1986. He certainly had range. Bob West would begin voicing Pasqually and Jasper later that year. Helen Henny was also recast in 1986 to Nancy Lenehan. 1986 seemed to be a big year for shaking up the voice actors, because one show tape from that year featured a different actor, possibly Lonnie Wilder, as both Chuck and Munch. Perhaps Wilson just wasn't available for that taping. In 1985, Pizza Time Theater's financial woes were too much. They ended up merging with their competitor, Showbiz Pizza, who was having their own money problems. Showbiz was home to a different animatronic ensemble, the Rock-afire Explosion. Starting in 1985, they began overseeing the production of show tapes, both for the Rock-afire and the Pizza Time players. The players had some personality shifts around this time, and I believe this was per Showbiz Pizza's instructions. The characters began acting much nicer. Chuck had already been softened up visually by this point, losing his cigar back in 1980. He would still make a few jabs at his fellow performers, but never as harshly as he used to. Jasper didn't giggle as much, so there was no need to call a technician to turn off the fruitcake dog. Munch and Jasper both became more laid back, and Pasqually got just a little goofier to balance them out. Helen retained her clucking, but it was toned down from her earlier performances. Toned down seems to be a good way to describe the characters moving forward. The zany, argumentative characters of the past were now mellow, kind-hearted buddies. Insults and hostility gave way to good-natured teasing at the worst. The shows felt friendlier, but in my opinion, a lot duller. We'll give the Pizza Time players another break and move our attention back to the lounge. One effort to drive up sales was King Cat, introduced near the end of 1984. Michael Jackson was a superstar, so it made sense to base a character on the King of Pop. The character was conceived as Michael Katzen, which is almost a pun. For budgetary reasons, his name was changed to King Cat so they could use the signage for the other king. Speaking of him, King Cat was a retrofit of that character. Like many of the Cabaret acts, the recordings were all of Michael himself. A sound-alike, Kenny Ingram, would have a line at the beginning or end. There was also an announcer that would alternate on certain songs. There was one new recording by Ingram, a birthday version of Billie Jean. Knowing that the company was facing major financial troubles really shines an interesting light on the show tape. As ShowbizPizza.com points out, most of Cat and the announcer's lines are plugs for different features of the restaurant. It gets downright shameless, sacrificing any semblance of character for cheap advertising.
You know, a very special part of Chuck E. Cheese is our birthday parties. Wouldn't it be nice to celebrate your mom or dad's next birthday right here with Chucky and me?
I mean, yes, I know I'm talking about what are essentially glorified mascots in the grand scheme of things, but let me ask you this. Would Dolli Dimples or Artie Antlers have degraded themselves like that? I think not.
We'll be right back with more music. Meanwhile, why don't you stroll over to Jasper Jowls General Store and see all the souvenirs, toys, shirts, and school supplies Jasper has.
Ultimately, King Cat came and went with little fanfare. The King, meanwhile, stuck around through the early 90s. I wonder if this was the King's alternate persona, trying to gauge what could keep him relevant with the kids. Perhaps he was ultimately happier being Elvis. I mean, you never see the King and King Cat in the same room, right? Oh. Well, this is embarrassing. The Beach Bowzers were a cabaret act added in 1985. Like the Shavers, they were a retrofitted version of the Beagles, with the same shtick. Unsurprisingly, they performed to old recordings of the Beach Boys. Instead of a designated leader doing the speaking, They were introduced by an unseen announcer who sounded like Ed Sullivan.
Our next guests are very special to me. They're the dogs who chewed up my really big shoes. Welcome the fabulous Beach Bowzers.
The announcer was only used half the time. The other half, the dogs would just perform a song without introduction. In 1991, the Bowzers received a new show tape that had a bit more effort put into it. The dogs still sang Beach Boys songs, but with newly recorded vocals. The announcer was ditched in favor of one of the Bowzers. The leader, now named Woody Bowzer, would do the occasional intro, speaking with a stereotypical party dude surfer voice. In one of his announcements, he referred to the others as his brothers. The dogs would bark occasionally during the songs.
Hey, cowabunga dudes, this is Woody Bowzer wanting you all to get up and dance. So let's go! Tubular, man!
The barking often fit in well with the upbeat songs. In slower songs, like Surfer Girl, it was kind of distracting. Before we return to Chuck and his friends, we'll take a look at the miscellaneous section. Here are some mysterious characters from the second half of the 80s. One of the most interesting and least documented experiments done around this time was the use of interactive animatronics. Family Album and Hot Fudge were acts that were added to Pizza Time Theater around 1983. Family Album had a trio of human characters that played their own instruments. They would sing along to pre-taped popular songs and talk to guests in between. The character names varied from location to location, along with their performers and personalities. I covered them a bit a few years ago in my unintentionally scary animatronics video. I critiqued the dialogue the characters had, not realizing it was being done live. I was lucky enough to have one of their performers actually comment on it, explaining that the footage I saw was taped between midnight and 3 a.m. with no real audience to work off of. Assuming this was some sort of test video, it helped put things in context. Another video has surfaced more recently, showing a more natural performance with an actual audience. While I still don't care for the character designs, this shed a lot of light on the animatronics and helped me appreciate them a little more. Hot Fudge was more or less the same thing. The characters were not original and were based on ones from a TV series of the same name. We had an older man named Mr. Cooch, a girl named Mona, and a fuzzy monster named Seymour. Like the Family Album, they alternated between performing pre-recorded songs and talking to the audience. I don't know if all three of them had this ability, but there's a bit of footage of Mr. Cooch talking to the crowd. One of the kids is definitely not into it.
Come on. Don't worry, I don't bite. I don't even have dentures.
You want to go with the Eddie?
Okay, well, I tell you what.
Around the same period, Showbiz Pizza actually had an interactive version of one of their own characters, Billy Bob. I'm not sure who influenced who. The interactive shows never really caught on at either pizza place, but I know other restaurants that have tried it over the years. The Jekyll and Hyde Club in New York comes to mind. Then we have the truly mysterious characters, ones that were either unused or have gone virtually undocumented. The one I have next to no information about is an octopus character who was most likely never installed. I read he was intended to be more or less a prop character that would appear to be playing the bandboard instruments. Other than that, we've got nothing. Then there's a duck character who's been referred to as DJ Duck, Dr. Ducks, and Dr. Quack. He was going to be a cabaret character, but it's unclear if he was ever actually installed anywhere. A newspaper article mentioned him appearing in 1980 and singing children's songs and nursery rhymes, but we have no footage or audio to confirm any of this. The two pictures we do have were taken behind the scenes when he was being developed, so we don't even know if this is actually how he looked. I can't say I care for either design. Our final mystery character, a rather tragic one, is Wolfman Zapp. Although he was not technically associated with Pizza Time Theater, I think it's fitting to talk about him here. He was created by Nolan Bushnell for an adult equivalent restaurant, Zapp's Bar and Grill. We only have a few photos of the Wolfman, who I will assume spoke like Wolfman Jack, his namesake. The character very much resembles a wolf version of Chuck E. Cheese, with sharp teeth and a big floppy tongue. Zapp's Bar and Grill did not last long, so most traces of Wolfman have vanished with the rising sun. The tragedy part comes not from the lack of Wolfman materials out there, but rather the story's coda. In 2015, new photos of the animatronic surfaced, and not good ones. It seems that an old, beat-up Zapp figure was used in some local parade, mounted to the front of a pickup truck. The user who uploaded the original photo quickly deleted it after they were contacted by a number of animatronic enthusiasts. On one hand, I really wish the figure had been better preserved, given how rare it is. On the other hand, I feel bad for whoever owns it and posted that picture. I'm guessing they didn't realize its value. It must be weird when you're having a normal day and suddenly getting bombarded with messages from random people shouting, "It belongs in a museum!" I don't think there are any winners here. On that depressing note, let's get back to the Pizza Time players. Spoiler warning, it also gets depressing. Although the characters no longer had a rotating guest star, there was still an aspect that was allowed to frequently change. Different shows called for different costumes for the animatronics. These costumes included Halloween outfits, Western wear, and clothes from different decades of rock and roll. In 1987 and onward, a new stage was introduced. The Rocker stage, also known as Chucky's House, gave the shows a homey appearance. Chuck, Helen, and Jasper were posed on the front porch, while Pasqually and Munch were inside. The Warblettes were phased out, replaced by some singing flowers. A new character was introduced around this time, Larry the Technician. Larry was seen as a puppet on TV screens, interacting with the performers. He would stick around for many years to come, sometimes appearing as a cartoon character voiced by Duncan Brannon or Robert Gotcher, and other times in live action played by Paul T. Taylor. Larry was always portrayed as being nerdy, well-meaning, and incredibly klutzy. A quick note of trivia that I can't really find a better place to stick in. In a 1988 show tape, Chuck mentions his great-grandfather was named Chet R. Cheese, and his great-grandmother was named Daisy. This was changed years later, when Chuck's backstory became about him being an orphan, who had no idea who his family was or when he was born. As I said earlier, these show tapes were adequate, but generally kind of dull. The characters were too good-natured. I don't think these kinds of shows have to be mean to be funny or entertaining, but the early, nastier versions of the characters were a riot compared to the milquetoast ones from the late 80s. Now, the shows were not only nicer, they were frequently sentimental. Their Salute to Kids show was treacly, and their 4th of July and Christmas shows were downright reverent. None of this was bad per se, but it was again a far cry from the broad humor of the 70s.
Oh, Chucky, I'm so happy.
Well, I'm happy you're happy. What's the occasion?
Well, I'm just glad to have all these kids and their folks with us today.
Yeah, it's nice to entertain them. Right, gang?
You're right, Chucky.
Another change was the attempt to make the characters a little more hip. We saw this right off the bat after Helen was reintroduced. Her first show as a permanent performer was called The Bandstand, which focused on rock and roll through the years. This one worked all right, since most of the songs they sang were considered oldies, even in 1984. A lot of the time, the characters seemed like parents, or even grandparents enjoying watching their kids have fun. It was very sweet, but the characters were not hip. They were square. I know square, because I'm square. How do I know that? I'm repeatedly using the word square for one thing. For another, I'm making this video. And I accept that about myself. The Pizza Time players did not. They were designed to do vaudeville numbers and old-fashioned show tunes. Hearing them try to cover contemporary pop songs in the late 80s was kind of embarrassing. Their rivals, the Rock-afire Explosion over at Showbiz Pizza, did a better job of that sort of thing. Speaking of the Rock-afire, this is where their stories start to line up more. Showbiz Pizza began calling the shots with the show tapes for both the Rock-afire and the Pizza Time players. Both sets of characters would have shows that followed the same themes around the same time. Movies, working, TV westerns, the 1988 Grammy Awards, etc. The scripts were generally different, but the tones and songs covered were often similar. In fact, the characters would soon get even more similar. If you're already a fan of the Rock-afire or Chuck E. Cheese, you knew this was coming. Cue up your Yanni albums, and welcome to the Concept Unification installation tape. At this point, Showbiz Pizza had been on the outs with creative engineering, the people responsible for the Rock-afire Explosion, for a while. There were plans to phase them out before this, replacing them with characters like Superman, Spider-Man, or Garfield. I think all of those ideas are wild, and I would love to know how they would have played out. Call it morbid curiosity. The closest thing we got was a very strange show tape featuring Yogi Bear and Boo Boo. The Rock-afire characters were not totally eliminated at this point. Yogi replaced Billy Bob, and Boo Boo replaced Looney Bird, but several other band members, Fats, Mitzi, Duke, and Beach Bear, interacted with the Hanna-Barbera characters. Amazingly, Yogi and Boo Boo's original voice actors, Dawes Butler and Don Messick, even reprised their roles. It was finally decided that the Pizza Time Theater and Showbiz Pizza locations would fully merge under the name Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza. This meant merging the bands as well. In 1990, the Rock-afire Explosion would be retrofitted into the Pizza Time players. But who would become who? There's a running theme in this video where the parts I find the most tantalizingly interesting are the ones that are the most mysterious. I suppose a lot of that is wanting what you can't have, wondering what secrets are out there yet to be discovered. That brings us to a very odd prototype stage for the retrofitted Rock-afire. The pre-existing rocker stage took place outside a house, and I like to think this prototype showed what was inside. It's a very wacky setup with some rather unflattering versions of the characters. Mitzi Mozzarella became Chuck E. Cheese, Duke LaRue, who played the drums, became Helen Henny on the keyboard, and Beach Bear, who played the guitar, became Jasper, also on the guitar. Over in the kitchen area, Fats Geronimo, who played the keyboard, became Pasqually, who didn't play anything. Billy Bob, Rolf, and Earl went unused. Where's Mr. Munch, you may ask? Everywhere. Although the photos don't show it, Munch was intended to be a traveling character. The Rock-afire stage had several other characters who would all become Munch. The Sun, the Moon, Antioch the Spider, and Looney Bird. Munch was meant to pop up all around the stage. As development continued on the new Pizza Time players, it was decided to make them closer in tone to the Rock-afire. The original characters didn't play instruments, aside from Jasper on guitar and Pasqually sometimes having an accordion, and these in-between versions only had a few of them doing so. It was decided that they would be a band themselves, and went from the Pizza Time players to Munch's Make-Believe Band. The actual conversion of the Rock-afire to Chuck E. Cheese is documented in a now infamous instruction video. Set to some incredibly melancholy music, a narrator goes over the process of retrofitting each character and prop. Many people, myself included, find the whole thing very depressing, both the tone of the video and the end of an era that it represents. Once again, Billy Bob, the main Showbiz Pizza mascot, wound up going unused. As for the others, Rolf and Earl became Chuck E. Cheese, Fats became Mr. Munch, Duke became Pasqually, Beach Bear once again became Jasper, and Mitzi became... Whoa, what happened to Helen? Remember when I said the Pizza Time players were kinda square? Well, one of the Rock-afire characters that was most beloved by the child audience was Mitzi Mozzarella. Mitzi, decked out in her cheerleader outfit, was meant to be a young girl herself, like the kids watching her. Her voice actress, Shalisa Sloan James, was quite young when she started voicing the character, which added to how genuinely she came across. Helen, meanwhile, had been frequently portrayed as an older actress with a lot of experience under her belt. Although the new Helen was still voiced by an adult, she now came across as much younger than she had been, and wore a very similar dress to Mitzi's cheerleader outfit. As a result of this, the other characters ended up coming off as a little younger by association, or maybe that's just me. I mean, Jasper still has a lot of wrinkles, but he's a hound dog. He had wrinkles as a baby, too. The already established Pizza Time theater stages had their share of cosmetic changes, but the Rock-afire stages had some extra characters on hand. The many Billy Bobs were scrapped, but I'm guessing they thought it'd be a waste to throw out everything. The problem was, the pre-existing Pizza Time theaters didn't have these extra characters to work with. To solve the problem, any new characters that were converted from the remaining figures would essentially act as set dressings, providing backup vocals or announcements, but little else. That way, it wouldn't really change much in the show tapes for any location. This group of characters may seem a little pointless, but they're an interesting bunch. Looney Bird became Pizza Cam, a buck-toothed living camera. For a character that barely did anything, he had a lot of personality in his appearance alone. The Rock-afire had a little bear named Choo Choo who sat inside a hollow stump and bobbed up and down to the music. They only acknowledged him once. He became Munch Jr., Mr. Munch's apparent son, who bobbed along inside a metal can. Munch Jr. was even stranger than Choo Choo, since he was never mentioned at all, despite being related to the band's headliner. The sun from the Rock-afire was converted into a high-rise building with a face. His friend, the Moon, stuck around as the only character who was completely unchanged. Lastly, some stages had a picture of Chuck's face in the top center. This figure has been dubbed the Wink because it would wink after each show segment. The new versions of Munch's Make-Believe Band were still much softer than the original Pizza Time players, but they had an energy that had been lacking during most of the 80s. In these early days of the rebrand, there were several voice recastings. Carlisa McKinney took over as Helen Henny, who no longer clucked, at least not to my recollection. Mr. Munch was voiced by Duncan Brannon, who gave him a deep, smoother voice. Duncan also took over for Chuck, who is officially now a mouse instead of a rat. Chuck got a snazzy new wardrobe, a tuxedo to add some class to the fun center. The idea of Chuck E. Cheese being classy at all is quite silly to an adult, but as a kid I thought he looked great. To me, the tux said quality entertainment. And as we all know, entertainment is Chuck's middle name. In a few moments, I'll take you to what Chuck E. Cheese is like today. I know that's skipping over a massive chunk of Pizza Time history, but this video is already quite long. As I said in the introduction, the reason I wanted to focus solely on the first 13 years is because those are the most fascinating. We got to see different designs and approaches to the staging, different characters come and go. It's not that Chuck E. Cheese never did anything of note beyond that time. In the 90s and 2000s, we had new stage setups like the Awesome Adventure Machine or the Studio C Alpha. We also had their Galaxy 5000 movie, which I covered a few years ago. I might cover the rest of this someday, but for now, I wanted to keep the focus on the old, crass, cigar-smoking rat of the past. As we drift out of that era of Chuck E. Cheese, I want to leave you with a quick personal memory. I can't exactly pinpoint the date on this one. It was sometime in the mid-90s, a snowy day in Massachusetts around Christmas. I remember going to a Chuck E. Cheese and spending a decent amount of time just looking up at the animatronics. There was something about them that both frightened and fascinated me. They really towered over you as a kid. I remember being a little freaked out by Pasqually, and most of all, staring up in awe at Chuck himself, with the big light-up star behind him. There's a real coziness to that memory. We all have those fond recollections of a simpler time, and one of mine happens to be at a Chuck E. Cheese. No matter what happens with the franchise going forward, I'm happy to have experienced these animatronics up close and personal. Finally, that brings us to current-day Chuck E. Cheese. The characters have been redesigned again to appear even younger and more appealing to kids. The animatronics have all been phased out, one location at a time. The band still performs, but now as puppets on TV screens. This is the part where I complain about how everything's changed for the worse. Except that's not quite how I feel. Now to be clear, I'm not happy with every change. I think the loss of the animatronics is a travesty, and really takes away a big piece of the franchise's identity. However, animatronics are difficult and expensive to maintain, and right now the economy isn't exactly booming. I do hope that whatever figures are being removed can find good homes with collectors who can take care of them, and I also hope that they will someday return in some shape or form to some of the restaurants. I don't know how likely either of these outcomes are, but it's a nice thought. The redesigns took a little bit for me to come around to. I grew up with the Tux and Avenger versions of Chuck. I always preferred the Tux version myself. When I saw the new version of the character from 2012, I was initially put off. I think a lot of that just comes from our general aversion to change, especially when it's something that we've known for most of our lives. It was also disappointing that Duncan Brannon, who voiced Chuck for a very long time, was replaced rather unceremoniously. The thing is, and I know I risk alienating a lot of Chuck E. Cheese fans when I say this, I don't think Avenger Chuck ever really worked for me. I know there are plenty of fans who are ride or die for this era, but I couldn't really gel with it. Even with his character getting softened a bit over the years, he still had the basic template of the cranky old carny from the 70s. I don't think he ever truly fit in the skater boy outfit they had him in for so long. There was that 70s residue there, and he always felt a little like a square peg in a round hole. There's some wonderful fan art of him doing the "How do you do, fellow kids?" doing that thing, and it really hits the nail on the head. Chucky's redesign is such a departure from the original that it no longer feels bound to that version. Normally, I don't like it when that happens, but this new character feels fresher than he has in a long time. Not to mention, the new segments with the puppet characters are generally entertaining. Please note that I haven't actually sat down and watched all of them. My favorites will always be the original, nastier Pizza Time players, but I can tell that the people working on the new material are having fun with it. That, and there are plenty of nods to the older days. Animatronic versions of Madam Oink, Dolli Dimples, and the King appeared in the obligatory Five Nights at Freddy's parody. Munch Jr. of all characters reappeared, now identified as one of Munch's many little siblings. Chuck owns a cat named Copernicus, who somewhat resembles Krusty. Speaking of Krusty, he actually got mentioned in a recent Easter egg. During a Halloween special, several Chucks from different universes show up. Yes, even Chuck E. Cheese jumped on the multiverse bandwagon. One of them is purple and speaks in reverse. If you play his message backwards, he says he's going to see Crusty the Cat play for the Wingers baseball team. Admittedly, he got the name wrong. Krusty's jersey said Swingers, but the most commonly seen photo covers up the S. Maybe the team really is called the Wingers in that universe. Either way, it's nice to know that Krusty, in some reality, managed to land on his feet. He is a cat after all. With the new emphasis on the puppets, it's actually possible to add many more characters. Most notably, Bella Bunny was added as a new member of the band, the first new member they've had in many years. Perhaps this could be a way to bring back some classic characters, like Crusty or Harmony. I'm still sad about the animatronics, but seeing these fan favorites have an actual chance of returning is a great silver lining. I'm left with mixed feelings. I've had a lot of fun putting this together and following the evolution of the band, but at the end of the day, I'm not the target audience anymore. As long as the kids are happy and enjoying themselves, that means Chuck E. Cheese is doing something right.